Hello, we are Group A. We're going to start a discussion on privilege and bias. Do you guys want to talk about two shorter pieces first or after the big?
Let's do the big one first. Lorraine, you were first, correct?
So the big one was having to do with like understanding the socio-political context of schooling, and basically like the overall. It starts off like with the overall argument, which is basically that education, specifically multicultural education, is shaped by socio-political context of the United States and the global society at large. But that we don't really treat them as if they are, which I have found to be the case in like schools I've worked with. Like we kind of like treat schools as if they're outside of these contexts when they're really not. They're actually very much connected, but we like to pretend that they're not interlaced. So that's kind of like the argument that this chapter like introduces us to, and then it tells us to like keep some assumptions in mind for the text, which is that language, culture, and identity are taken as facts, and that like helps multicultural education, but that we have to look at these broader ideas through the lenses of privilege and power structures. Moreover, it kind of like tries to make the argument that multicultural education is for everyone, but for the context of this text, it's going to include American Indians, Latinos, African American, Asian, and like multicultural students, because multicultural and bilingual education came out of like the civil rights movement, which was particularly about going against racism. And another assumption was that teachers are not the villains, which I thought was like really interesting. And I think it happens a lot where teachers are looked upon as soon as like the students like fail academically, and especially in like underprivileged communities. And even though a lot of these teachers are genuinely like concerned about student success, they fail them because of like stereotypes that we have within our minds that we really can't go against, which one of the other texts pointed that out, how even when we try to like actively go against these biases and stereotypes that are already in our mind, it kind of still works, they still work within us. So yeah, so it stops us from really being able to teach students of diverse backgrounds. And this goes for all teachers, just not white teachers. And I thought that was really interesting. It's specifically like this part where it talks about how a teacher's identity from a non-white ethnic group does not guarantee that she will be effective. Teachers are often at the mercy of decisions made by others from far removed from the classroom. And I thought that was like I could relate to that so much because I worked at a underprivileged charter school actually this year, and there were so many things that I felt like I connected my children on a like socioeconomic level, so I can like satisfy like their learning needs. However, like when I try to implement things into the classroom, it was difficult too because I was working against all these other people who are not acquainted with your classroom or with your children, but control everything. So that was like, that like hit home for me, and that was like before even diving into the text. So, and then last but not least, that public education can provide good quality education. So these were basically the assumptions, and then of the text that they framed for us. And then it moved on to go into the defining the socio-political context of multicultural education. And it goes through, it goes through like these things that they want us to like understand as readers in order to get the chapter. So I'm just going to focus on the first one because that's where my assigned reading was most focused on. And it's basically clarify goals and key terms of multicultural education. So the goals, it seems, is to basically tackle inequality and promote access to equal education and rise the achievement of all students while providing them high quality education, and to provide students like an equal opportunity to really live up to their full potential. And then it goes into the key terms in multicultural education, which one of them was equality versus equity. And I've never looked at equity in these terms, I guess, so that was kind of new for me. And it was basically that equity is basically the process while equality is the result. And how it's basically just like being able to have all these all these layers of being able to teach to satisfy like different types of students coming from different types of background. And I thought that was like really like a really progressive way to look at it, because normally like at least the schools I've worked for want you to teach one certain type of way, and like if the students don't get it, then it's kind of like they're set up to fail in a way. So I kind of saw this as like, yeah, like that idea can actually work for us as teachers. Like just using different teaching styles to meet their needs. And then social justice, basically they define it as an approach and action of treating everyone with fairness, respect, dignity, and generosity. And how on a societal level, this is like kind of simple, basically giving everyone the real opportunity to achieve his or her full potential. But on an educational level, it's more about challenging and confronting like misconceptions and basically bringing them into the classroom and implementing them through your curriculum. Like always like actively having those topics there for students to basically work with and come up with their like strengths through that, and creating a learning environment that works for them. So going back from page 10 to 11, there was just basically this blurb, which was about terminology. And I thought that was interesting, how they tried to like say that basically we're going to use people of color over minorities. And I really like that because I do identify myself as a person of color. And I actually like with my students, I always made sure they saw themselves as people of color and not like minorities, even though they were only second graders, but they already knew like we're minority. And I like how this text does take that term, but basically they like tell you all the reasons why it still doesn't work, and it makes you realize how language is really like it always fluctuates. So like you can't even stick to people of color. Like that has to be revised in the future because there's so many cons against that term. There was just like only one pro that they basically put to using this this specific term. So yeah.
All right, can I interrupt real quick? I just got a notification that said that we have 8 minutes left in this meeting and then it's no longer free. So we might have to start another meeting just to
have like enough time.
Yeah, I just saw that. I'm done, so.
Okay, I just didn't want to cut you off, but yeah, we have 7 minutes and 39 seconds left.
Yeah.
Is there a way to extend it?
You have to pay for it? $14.99 a month? I know.
Okay.
So if we get cut off, I'll just start another meeting and we can go from there.
Okay. Well, Lorraine, while you were talking, it just made me think about, like, the way you summarized it made me think about how identities are not static, and especially for kids, like, that's, you know, you're developing your identity constantly, and like how you were saying that, like, how we be careful about what language we use will affect like how their identities grow and change. And I don't want to say too much because I know we have to get through this. Okay, so is it okay if I move on to the next part? So the next part was this huge section, the achievement gap, which they use in quotations. They're really critical of it because they're saying that it places this responsibility on the students, the responsibility of learning. But then they're also saying, well, statistically, there is a huge problem for certain groups of students that they're not performing as well as white students. So they try to ameliorate the language of achievement gap by calling it either resource gap, opportunity gap, or expectation. And then in kind of the rest of this section, they're trying to focus on the major factors of these gaps and kind of solutions to them. So one of the factors that they talk about is sociocultural factors. So these are kind of more things related to like students' identities and home life in their communities. And then the other main factor that they identify are school-related factors. So like the teachers, the funding for the school's resources. And they were saying that these achievement gaps persist because a really common response to these gaps is to just focus on too much on the sociocultural problems that the students like might be experiencing, and not enough on the problems of school structures and school funding and those inequities that exist. But then they also talked about some positive examples of schools that should be not doing well but are dispelling this myth. And the schools that are performing well, common traits. They said that one of those is a really demanding curriculum, and the other is the strong social support system. So you could say that the demanding curriculum is trying to solve the school-related factor, and then the social support system is trying to solve the socio-cultural issues. And then they also talked about what they call dropout factories, where schools have high dropout rates, and just how that's so connected to their funding, and that this signifies the need to revisit those efforts to desegregate school systems, because even, you know, in cities across the country today, school systems are still very, very segregated. And if their funding is dependent on property values and stuff like that, then there's going to continue to be inequities between schools. And then in the last part, they talked very briefly about deficit theories, which is like something that, you know, saying that children have implicit differences and making them inferior to other children. Again, they're saying this is very problematic because it places all the agency of learning on kids and not on the social and educational structures that are surrounding them. And then they also talked a lot about immigration and difference, and that was really important. I think the point that they were talking about, where immigration is not new and it's not completely old either, because they're saying how in history classes, like, they kind of view this romanticized view of like the Pilgrims came over and whatever, but immigration is a continuing trajectory throughout American history, and that but yet there's still this kind of intimidation and mockery in schools today for more recent immigrants. So they were suggesting that for teachers to combat this, that teachers, no matter what you're teaching, should underscore that our history includes constant immigration in this country, and also forced immigration and slavery, and to not romanticize those aspects of American history. And then they also said that teachers, like in our personal lives, should take the time to challenge ourselves and read about points of view that got really overlooked in American history, and to kind of like keep ongoing journals. I mean, I don't know how realistic that is, but to keep ongoing journals about like what we learn about identities and language. And then they were just talking again about ideologies and beliefs in society and how they get translated into school systems, whether intentionally or not. And then in the last part of my section, they started talking about demographics in the school system. And I kind of found, well, I thought that part of this was kind of problematic. So it's on page 22. And it's a graph of like demographics changing over time. And it's called Resident Population by Sex, Race, and Hispanic Origin Status. And this is always a huge issue, I think, that this separation of races into certain groups, and that like Hispanic origin is separate from race, and like who gets to decide that. So that just for me, like how the people who did this study chose to do that was kind of strange. But they were basically trying to show like the growth of multicultural groups of people and non-white groups of people over time, and that there were large percentage changes. Should we? And I'm kind of done. So should we stop and do a new
Yeah,
chat?
I'll stop and make a new one.
Okay. All right. See you guys in a minute.
Okay.